The morning air in downtown Arlington was laced with the scent of roasted coffee beans and rain-soaked pavement. Inside the modest corner cafe called Whispering Bean, Lena Hart moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had built her life around quiet consistency. She had opened the shop 5 years earlier with nothing but her mother's handwritten recipes, a borrowed espresso machine, and a stubborn belief that good things could still grow from small beginnings. Every morning before sunrise, she wiped down the counters, folded the checkered napkins, and filled the display with pastries that seemed to carry the warmth of home itself. Customers came not just for coffee but for comfort, the kind that came from her gentle voice, her careful smile, and the way she remembered every regular's favorite drink. Yet beneath that calm exterior, Lena's world was trembling. The bills stacked behind the register were more than just paper. They were silent weights pressing down on every breath. The city had raised rent again. The supplier had increased prices, and her mother's lingering hospital debts were still haunting her balance sheets. She told no one. To her loyal customers, she was still the cheerful barista who offered inspiration with every cappuccino. Only at night, when the city lights blurred through the rain-spattered window, did she let the truth spill out. Tears she wiped away with flour-dusted fingers, whispering promises that tomorrow she would find a way. That fragile tomorrow arrived on a Tuesday. The bell above the door chimed, and Lena glanced up, expecting one of her regulars. Instead, the air seemed to shift. A tall man in an immaculate black coat stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of crisp rain and authority. He looked entirely out of place among the chipped mugs and hand-painted menu board. His presence carried a quiet intensity, not arrogance, but the stillness of someone used to command. He paused for a moment, studying the room as if memorizing every detail. Then his gaze landed on her. The look held her still, not in fear but in something far heavier, recognition of a world too large for her own. "You're Lena Hart," he said, his voice low, smooth, and threaded with something unnameable. "Yes, I am," she replied cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron. "How can I help you?" "My name is Ethan Cole." The name struck her like a bell. Everyone in Arlington had heard of him, the reclusive billionaire whose company, Cole Innovations, had built half the skyline. He was the man newspapers called the Steel Visionary, known for turning failing industries into empires. To see him here in her tiny cafe felt surreal. "I believe your mother once worked for Cole Developments," he continued, pulling an envelope from his coat. "She took a business loan 12 years ago, a partnership grant technically, but when the company merged, the file came under my personal division. It was rediscovered last quarter during an audit." Lena's heart stuttered. "A loan. There must be a mistake." "My mother never told me." "It isn't a mistake," he interrupted gently. "The documents are signed in her name. The outstanding balance with interest stands at $2.7 million. The words drained the color from the room. The steady hum of the coffee machine, the chatter of customers, even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to fade into silence. Lena gripped the counter, her throat tightening. "I can't, that's impossible. She passed away. I've been running this place alone ever since. I can't possibly." "I know," he said quietly, setting the envelope down between them. "And I'm not here to demand payment." He looked at her with a strange calmness that unsettled her more than anger would have. "I'm here because I believe we might be able to help each other." Lena blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "Help each other?" Ethan nodded. "My board has been restless. Investors are questioning my leadership after a personal scandal that wasn't entirely my fault. They want proof of stability. Someone beside me, someone who shows that I can be trusted to represent something human. I need to restore their confidence fast. You, Miss Hart, represent the one thing my world has lost. Authenticity. You built this place with your own hands. You take care of people. You remind them of warmth. I need that image." The proposal lingered in the air like static before a storm. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she whispered. "A contract marriage," he said simply. 1 year. No obligations beyond the public appearance. In return, I will personally clear your mother's debt, ensure this cafe remains under your ownership, and fund whatever expansion you wish afterward. You'll be financially independent at the end of the term." Lena stared at him, disbelief battling against exhaustion. "You can't be serious." "I don't make offers I don't intend to keep." His tone softened slightly. "You're small, Miss Hart, but that isn't an insult. It means you still fit into places the rest of us have outgrown. Kindness, honesty, trust. My world has forgotten those things. For a long moment, Lena said nothing. She looked around her cafe, the little chalkboard with hand-drawn hearts, the chipped mug that belonged to her mother, the picture of them together on opening day. Every inch of this space carried her mother's laughter, her dreams. Losing it would be like losing her all over again. The thought made her knees weak. What if I say no? She asked finally, her voice trembling. Then the bank proceeds with foreclosure next month. The debt will transfer to your name. I'll have to sign off on the legal notice. He hesitated, almost painfully. I don't want to do that. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Outside, rain began to fall. Slow at first, then steady, streaking the windows like tears. Lena pressed her palms to the counter, feeling the cool wood beneath her skin. She thought of every dawn she had risen before light, every loaf baked by hand, every customer who had told her this cafe felt like home. Could she let all of that vanish because of pride? Could she trust a man whose life was built on deals to protect what was left of hers? I need time, she whispered. You have until tomorrow morning, Ethan replied, sliding a sleek business card toward her. My driver will wait outside at 9 a.m. if you choose to accept. Then he turned and left, his reflection disappearing into the rain. That night, Lena didn't sleep. She sat at the small table by the window of her apartment above the cafe, the city lights flickering below like restless fireflies. She reread the documents until the words blurred. Her mother's signature, the company seal, the numbers she could never repay. They all stared back, undeniable. She thought of Ethan Cole's expression, controlled, unreadable yet shadowed by something almost lonely. What kind of man could buy anything but seemed haunted by everything? By dawn, the decision was made. She couldn't lose her mother's legacy. She couldn't watch the doors close forever on the one place that still felt alive. When 9 o'clock came, a black car waited outside. Lena locked the cafe, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the whole street could hear. The driver opened the door silently. Inside, the world changed. Plush leather seats, tinted windows, quiet classical music. Everything screamed wealth, control, precision. Ethan sat beside her, scrolling through his tablet. When their eyes met, he said simply, "You've made your choice." "I have," she said softly. "Then let's begin." The day moved like a dream. Legal offices, contracts, signatures. Within hours, the impossible was done. She was Mrs. Ethan Cole. The ceremony was nothing more than paperwork and polite witnesses, but to Lena it felt like stepping into another dimension, a place where logic dissolved and only survival remained. When the final pen stroke was made, Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've just changed both our lives." He escorted her to his residence, not a home, but a monument. The Cole penthouse crowned the city like a glass fortress. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed clouds brushing against the skyline. Polished marble floors reflected every movement. It was breathtaking but cold, like beauty carved from ice. "This is where you'll live," Ethan said as the elevator doors opened into a vast living space. "Your room is down the hall. You'll have full access to everything. If you need anything, speak to Grace, my assistant." "And Lena?" He hesitated, surprising her. "You don't owe me anything beyond what we agreed." "I won't cross any line," she nodded, though her mind was spinning. "I understand." That night after he retreated to his study, Lena stood by the window looking out at the city below. The light stretched endlessly. Millions of tiny worlds, each filled with people chasing dreams, love, or simply the next day's peace. She felt impossibly small among them, yet somehow not powerless. She had made a choice. She had stepped into a world that didn't fit her, but maybe that was exactly why she belonged there, to remind it of something it had forgotten. Later, a soft knock came at her door. Ethan stood there holding a white box. "I almost forgot," he said, offering it to her. Inside was a small vanilla cupcake topped with delicate sugar petals. "From your cafe. I asked Grace to pick it up this morning. Thought you might want a piece of home." Lena's throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said simply. "But sometimes small things matter more than big ones." When he left, Lena sat on the bed, the cupcake in her lap. The sweetness, familiar and fragile, grounded her. The city's hum faded into the distance, replaced by the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt suspended, on the edge of something she couldn't name. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was hope. That night, as storm clouds rolled over the city, two souls under one roof began a story neither of them had planned. A contract written in ink, sealed in silence, but destined to rewrite everything they thought they knew about strength, trust, and the price of freedom. The first few days in Ethan Cole's world felt like living inside a dream that refused to end. A dream made of glass, silence, and distance. Lena had never known quietness that loud. The penthouse was enormous, stretching in all directions with polished marble floors, mirrored corridors, and walls made of cold light. Everything gleamed, yet nothing seemed alive. There were no signs of laughter, no photos, no imperfections. It was a world built to impress, not to comfort. Every morning she woke up in her room, a space larger than her entire apartment, with floor-length curtains spilling golden sunlight across a king-sized bed that felt like it belonged to someone else. She would sit there for minutes, staring at the view that stretched beyond comprehension, the entire city unfolding like a living map below her. For someone who had grown up counting every dollar and every small victory, it felt surreal to be surrounded by everything she could never afford, and yet to feel emptier than ever. Ethan was courteous, distant, and precise. A man who spoke only when necessary and moved like time itself bent around his schedule. He left every morning before she even finished her breakfast and returned late at night, when the city lights shimmered like 1,000 promises across the skyline. His footsteps echoed through the marble halls, measured and predictable, like someone who had mastered control to such an extent that emotion no longer dared interrupt him. The few times they shared a meal, the air between them was calm but charged, like an unspoken understanding of two people trapped in the same storm but standing on opposite ends of the sky. Lena watched him carefully, studying the way he read reports even while eating, the subtle weariness in his eyes, the faint frown that appeared when silence lingered too long. Beneath all his steel composure, she sensed something else. Not arrogance, but exhaustion. A man who had conquered every mountain only to find emptiness waiting at the top. One evening after dinner, Ethan surprised her by asking, "Do you ever get tired of small things?" His question broke the silence between them. Lena looked up from her tea, confused. "Small things?" she repeated. "Yes, the tiny details that don't matter in the grand picture. Coffee cups, pastries, handwritten notes. All of it." His tone wasn't mocking. It was genuinely curious. She smiled faintly, setting her cup down. "I don't think small things ever stop mattering. They're what make the big things feel real. You can build towers and empires, Mr. Cole, but if there's no warmth in them, what's the point of standing so tall?" He stared at her for a long time, the faintest flicker of thought crossing his face, as if her words had struck a place inside him he hadn't visited in years. Finally, he said quietly, "That's what I used to believe, before people taught me that warmth is a weakness in business." "Maybe in business," she said softly, "but not in life." That conversation changed something subtle between them. Over the following weeks, Ethan began to linger a little longer in the mornings. Sometimes, when he left for work, he would ask if she needed anything for the cafe or if she was eating well. At first, his words sounded like politeness, but over time, they began to carry something almost human. A concern he couldn't completely hide behind his professional mask. Lena, in turn, began to explore the penthouse beyond her assigned space. She found a vast library lined with old books, untouched for years, and began reading there every afternoon. She discovered that Ethan's late mother had been a teacher, and his father, a cold industrial magnate who believed emotions were distractions. It wasn't hard to see how Ethan had become the man he was. A machine built by necessity, taught to win, never taught to feel. Yet the more Lena observed him, the more she saw glimpses of the person beneath the surface. One evening, when he returned unusually late, she found him standing alone in the library, staring at a portrait above the fireplace, a painting of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Your mother?" she asked softly from the doorway. Ethan didn't move for a long moment before nodding. "She believed in people," he said quietly, "even when they disappointed her. She told me once that money was a tool, not a goal, that if I ever lost sight of the difference, I'd lose myself. I didn't listen. I told her the world doesn't reward kindness, I think. She stopped arguing after that. His voice broke slightly, just enough for her to hear the human underneath the businessman. Lena stepped closer, her heart tightening. She sounds like someone who saw light in places others ignored, she said. Maybe she saw that in you too, even when you couldn't. That night, for the first time since their arrangement began, they shared dinner not as strangers bound by paper, but as two souls learning to trust the silence between them. They didn't talk about business or contracts. They talked about memories. Hers of the cafe and her mother teaching her to knead dough at dawn. His of childhood days spent sneaking into his mother's classroom just to listen to her read stories to her students. By the end of the meal, something fragile but undeniable had formed. Respect. Not love, not yet, but something that made the distance between them feel less unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and the illusion of their arrangement became part of a quiet rhythm. Publicly, they appeared together at charity galas and corporate dinners. Their photographs splashed across media headlines. Ethan Cole's new beginning. Privately, they existed as companions learning the boundaries of trust. The world saw perfection, elegance, wealth, and charm, but only they knew the truth. Their connection wasn't built on attraction or convenience, but on the raw humanity of two people rebuilding themselves through each other's presence. Lena, once terrified of the skyscraper world, began to hold herself with quiet confidence. Ethan, once indifferent to emotion, began to see the value in sincerity. One night, a major investor event demanded their attendance. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, the air thick with power and perfume. Lena stood beside Ethan, dressed in an elegant navy gown chosen by his stylist, her hair softly curled, her posture poised. When they entered, every eye turned toward them. She felt small at first, like an imposter in a world built for giants. But then Ethan leaned slightly closer and whispered, "Don't shrink. You belong here more than they do." The words, simple yet grounding, carried her through the evening. When reporters approached, she answered their questions with quiet warmth, earning admiration that Ethan's usual icy professionalism never did. Later, when the event ended, Ethan watched her from the car window as the city lights reflected in her eyes. "You handled them better than I ever could," he said. "You made them listen without saying much." She smiled, exhausted but content. Maybe because I wasn't trying to make them listen. I was just being me. For the first time in years, Ethan laughed. Not the polite, controlled kind, but something genuine, unguarded. It startled both of them. "It's been a long time since I remembered what that feels like," he admitted. Lena looked out at the skyline, her reflection beside his. "Maybe it's not too late to start again," she said softly. "You can't rewrite the past, but you can build something better on top of it." In the weeks that followed, their lives began to intertwine in ways neither expected. Ethan started visiting the cafe she still managed remotely, surprising her one morning by showing up unannounced in casual clothes. The customers nearly fainted at the sight of the city's most powerful man sipping coffee among them. Yet he seemed oddly at peace there, listening to the hum of conversation, the smell of cinnamon and sugar replacing the sterile scent of boardrooms. Lena caught him smiling once, just slightly, as a little girl handed him a cupcake and said, "You look sad, mister. Eat this. My mom says sugar helps." Ethan looked down at the cupcake, then at Lena, who was watching from behind the counter, and something inside him shifted quietly. He wasn't just visiting her cafe. He was rediscovering what it meant to feel alive. But the world of power doesn't forgive softness easily. As news of their unusual marriage spread, whispers began. Reporters questioning her past, investors hinting she was a distraction, tabloids branding her the cafe girl who tamed the tycoon. Lena bore it with quiet dignity, but Ethan could see the toll it took. One night he found her sitting alone in the penthouse library, staring at her phone. "They're calling me a fraud," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "They say I married you for money, that I'm too small for your world." Maybe they're right. Ethan's expression darkened. He took the phone from her hand and set it aside. "Don't ever let them decide your worth," he said firmly. "You're here because I chose truth over pretense. You've given me something no one else could. Honesty. Let them talk. The world has always been louder than it is right." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "You think I'm strong enough to stay in your world?" she asked softly. Ethan's voice dropped to a near whisper. "You already are. The world just hasn't caught up yet." From that night onward, things began to change, not outwardly, but within. Lena started holding her head higher at events, no longer flinching under scrutiny. She began advising Ethan on community projects, suggesting ideas that humanized his company's image: charity drives, small business grants, public outreach programs. Investors noticed the change in Ethan's leadership style. The cold businessman was turning into something new, compassionate but still commanding. And through it all, Lena remained at his side, her quiet strength reshaping the world that once deemed her too small. One rainy evening, months after their contract had begun, Ethan stood by the window watching lightning dance across the horizon. Lena approached, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You work too late," she said, handing him one. He smiled faintly, taking it. "Old habits." She looked at him for a moment, the storm light flickering across his face. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The deal we made?" He turned toward her, his gaze steady. "Every deal I've ever made, I've done for gain. This is the first one that gave me something I didn't expect: peace." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The thunder rolled, and rain streaked the glass like liquid silver. Lena realized that she no longer felt like a guest in his world. She had carved her place here not by wealth or power, but by being unshakably herself. Ethan realized something too: that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered softly through kindness, persistence, and faith. Their story was still bound by paper, but what grew between them could never be written in contracts. It was built on lessons neither of them had expected to learn: that vulnerability could be a form of courage, and that sometimes the smallest heart could fit into the largest world simply because it refused to shrink. The passing months after, the stormy night brought subtle transformations that neither Ethan nor Lena could have predicted. What began as a contract of necessity had turned into something that resembled companionship, not in the romantic sense, but in the quiet, grounding way 2 souls recognize each other's wounds without speaking them aloud. Ethan had started to change in ways his world did not immediately understand. The ruthless precision that had defined his leadership for years began to soften, giving way to decisions guided by empathy as much as efficiency. His boardroom, once a place of iron negotiations and cold transactions, now echoed with new ideas: community outreach programs, educational scholarships, small business initiatives, all seeds planted by Lena's unwavering belief that power was meaningless if it didn't lift others. Yet the higher they rose in moral value, the more fragile the structure beneath began to tremble. Because for every new believer in Ethan's transformation, there was a skeptic waiting to see him fall. Lena noticed it first in the way the business press began to shift their tone. Headlines no longer praised Ethan's innovation but questioned his distraction. "The tycoon turned sentimental," one article declared. "Love makes him weak," another whispered across social media, paired with photographs of Lena smiling at his side. At first she ignored it, telling herself that public opinion was just noise. But in the quiet moments, when Ethan was away and she was left staring out of the penthouse windows, the weight of those words began to settle like dust on her heart. She wasn't used to being watched, analyzed, or discussed by strangers who knew nothing about her. In her world, people judged you by the kindness in your actions, not the gossip in headlines. But in Ethan's world, perception was power, and perception could destroy you long before truth had a chance to speak. Ethan tried to protect her from it, but even he couldn't control every narrative. His company's shareholders began to voice concerns, subtly at first, then openly during meetings. "She's a distraction," one executive said during a quarterly review. "You've changed, Ethan. You used to focus on the numbers. Now you're talking about people, about feelings. That's not what built this company." Ethan's gaze was steady, his voice calm, but beneath the table, his hands tightened into fists. "What built this company," he said slowly, "was a vision. a belief that we could change how the world works. Maybe I just stopped confusing progress with profit. The room fell silent, but the seed of dissent had been planted. That night, when he returned home, Lena saw the strain in his eyes. He didn't need to tell her what had happened. She could read it in the slight slump of his shoulders and the silence that followed him through the door. Without a word, she walked into the kitchen, brewed 2 cups of coffee, and handed him one. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. "They think I've gone soft," he said finally. "They think you've changed me, made me weaker." Lena looked at him, unflinching. "Maybe that's the strongest thing that's ever happened to you," she said. "You built an empire, Ethan, but you were its prisoner. Now you're building something with meaning. If they can't see the difference, that's their loss." Her words settled in the air between them, steady and sure, like the voice of someone who had learned to stand tall after being told all her life that she was too small. Days turned into long weeks and challenges mounted like storm clouds. Rumors began to swirl that one of Ethan's former partners, a man named Marcus Vale, was planning a hostile takeover, using the company's sudden shift in public perception as leverage. Marcus had been one of the executives who left after Ethan refused to approve a questionable merger that would have displaced hundreds of workers. Now, with investors uneasy, Marcus saw his chance to strike back. The media loved the drama, painting Ethan as the fallen king of finance and Lena as the naive woman who had unknowingly toppled him. The narrative was cruel, relentless, and dangerously effective. Lena found herself blamed for everything, for the softened image, for the shift in focus, for the supposed downfall of a man she was only trying to help rediscover his humanity. She read the comments online, the endless stream of strangers calling her a gold digger, a manipulator, a fraud. She tried to ignore it, but late one night when she thought Ethan was asleep, she sat in the dark corner of the library, tears sliding down her cheeks silently. She had always believed that strength meant endurance, but in that moment, she realized that strength also meant allowing yourself to break, and then choosing to stand up again anyway. Ethan found her there, eyes red but posture still upright, clutching one of his mother's old books. He walked over without a word and sat beside her. "They're tearing you apart for being real," he said quietly. "I've spent years surrounded by people who wear masks so tight they forget their own faces. You've done nothing but tell the truth, and they can't stand it because it reminds them what they've lost." Lena wiped her face and looked at him. "They'll destroy you if you keep protecting me," she whispered. "You should let me go, Ethan. End the contract. Save your company." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of every choice he had ever made, he said, "I didn't make this agreement because it was convenient. I made it because it was right, and I won't build my empire again on someone else's suffering, and not yours, not anyone's. If I lose everything for that, then maybe it's what I deserve." The following week, the crisis reached its peak. Marcus Vale launched a media campaign accusing Ethan of financial misconduct, completely fabricated but damaging enough to trigger investigations. Reporters camped outside the coal building, cameras flashing whenever Ethan or Lena appeared. It was chaos, and for the first time Lena saw fear flicker in Ethan's controlled expression. Not fear of losing money, but fear of losing what he had begun to rebuild, his integrity. Yet even in the storm, she refused to retreat. She stood beside him during every press conference, every meeting, every confrontation. The world could call her names, but she knew who she was. And slowly, quietly, that unshakable calm began to win people over. Employees defended her. Community members from her cafe spoke publicly about her kindness. Even small business owners she had helped through Ethan's programs began posting their gratitude online. Ethan's team compiled all of it into a presentation for the board. Proof that authenticity was not a weakness, but the foundation of trust. During the final meeting that would decide his fate as CEO, Ethan spoke with a fire that left the room breathless. "For years," he said, "we've measured success by how high we can climb. But the higher we go, the smaller the world looks beneath us. We stop seeing people. We stop listening. Miss Hart reminded me that business is not built on numbers, it's built on belief. If you think that makes me weak, then you've forgotten what made this company worth anything in the first place. When he finished, the room was silent. Some looked away in shame, others simply nodded. That day, the vote came down in his favor. Ethan Cole remained CEO. When he returned home that evening, Lena was waiting by the window watching the sunset turn the city gold. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it," he corrected, setting his briefcase down. For a long moment they simply stood there, the silence between them heavy but peaceful. Then, almost as if confessing to himself, Ethan said, "I used to think strength meant control, that if I could manage everything, nothing could break me. But now I know that real strength isn't about never falling. It's about finding someone who helps you rise when you do." Lena turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. "And I used to think being small meant being invisible. But maybe small things are what keep the big things from collapsing. Maybe I was never too small for your world, Ethan. Maybe your world just needed to remember what small feels like." Outside, the first stars began to appear, faint but steady against the darkening sky. In that quiet, shared moment, they both realized that what had begun as an arrangement born from desperation had turned into something far more profound. Not love in the way the world defined it, but a partnership rooted in truth, purpose, and mutual respect. The city below them hummed with its usual chaos, but up there, in that glass fortress that had once felt like a cage, peace had finally found its way in. Yet even as calm settled over their lives, neither of them knew that the next chapter would demand more of them than any storm before. Because true transformation never ends with victory. It begins with what comes after, when the applause fades, and you must decide who you will be once the world stops watching. Peace, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like silence. It felt like balance. Weeks after the boardroom victory, Ethan and Lena began to live not as symbols or survivors, but as two people slowly learning what it meant to breathe without fear of being watched. The world had quieted its noise. The headlines softened, investors calmed, and for a fleeting moment, life became ordinary again. Ethan's company found new momentum under his renewed leadership, this time driven not by the hunger to dominate, but by the responsibility to create. Lena, too, returned to her old cafe, not as an escape, but as a reminder of where everything began. The small chalkboard menu still bore her handwriting. The regulars still greeted her with warm smiles. But something within her had changed. The girl who once trembled under the weight of debt and doubt now stood with a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. She had walked through the storms of wealth and deceit and emerged not richer, but stronger, her voice steadier, her purpose clear. Ethan often accompanied her there in the early mornings when the city was still yawning awake, sitting by the window in rolled-up sleeves, a simple coffee in hand. Those were the hours when he seemed most human, stripped of the corporate armor, watching Lena interact with customers, laugh at children's jokes, and offer warmth with effortless sincerity. He often wondered how she managed it, how she remained untainted by cynicism, despite everything the world had thrown her way. Once, he told her, "I spent years learning how to manage people, but you taught me how to understand them." She smiled, replying softly, "Understanding people isn't about studying them, Ethan. It's about listening long enough to hear what they don't say." It was in these small exchanges that their bond deepened, not through grand gestures but through shared silences that carried the weight of mutual respect and unspoken gratitude. But peace, as life often proves, is fragile, and its fragility was tested sooner than either expected. It began with a call from an old journalist named Peter Graves, a man known for uncovering the hidden truths behind powerful empires. He reached out to Ethan directly, asking for an interview regarding the transformation of Cole Enterprises. Ethan declined politely, suspecting ulterior motives. But 2 weeks later, an article surfaced. Bold, invasive, and dangerously persuasive. The headline read, "The Humanity Hoax, How a Tycoon Rebranded His Greed with a Love Story." The piece accused Ethan of orchestrating his marriage to Lena as a public relations stunt, suggesting that the debt story was fabricated to manipulate sympathy and rebuild his image. It quoted unnamed sources, twisted facts, and implied that Lena was a paid actress used to soften his reputation. The impact was immediate and brutal. Within hours, social media erupted with accusations, memes, and renewed hatred. The empire they had rebuilt with honesty was suddenly burning under the flames of suspicion. Lena found out when she walked into the cafe that morning and saw her face plastered across the newsfeed on a customer's phone. The look in their eyes, pity mixed with curiosity, cut deeper than words ever could. She didn't cry this time. She just stood still, the sound of the espresso machine fading behind her. She had fought too hard to crumble again, but the ache that bloomed in her chest was undeniable. When Ethan arrived, she didn't speak. She simply handed him her phone with the headline glowing in red across the screen. His jaw tightened as he read, but his eyes stayed calm. Too calm, the kind of calm that comes when anger has turned into resolve. "I'll handle it," he said, but Lena shook her head. "You can't handle the truth like a business deal, Ethan, not this time. The more you fight, the more they'll twist it." "So what do you suggest?" he asked quietly. "We do what we've always done," she said. "We tell the truth, but not to them, to the people who matter." That night, instead of issuing a press statement, Ethan invited the public to an open community forum at one of his company's charity centers. Reporters flocked to it, expecting another corporate performance. What they found instead was something raw and human. Ethan stood before the audience without a script or notes, his voice steady but stripped of its usual authority. "You've all read what they said," he began, "and maybe you believe it. Maybe it's easier to think that kindness is just another business strategy. I used to believe that too, that everything could be measured in return on investment. But I was wrong. This woman," he said, turning toward Lena, who stood quietly beside him, "taught me that real worth doesn't need witnesses or headlines. She didn't fix me. She reminded me that I wasn't broken. You can call our story fake, you can mock it, but you can't erase the truth we've lived. I don't ask for your belief, only your patience to watch what we build next." The room fell into a hush. Cameras flashed, but this time they captured something that couldn't be twisted: sincerity. That moment went viral in a way neither expected. The clip spread across the internet not as scandal but as testimony. People saw the tremor in Ethan's voice, the steady strength in Lena's posture, the undeniable authenticity in their story. The narrative began to shift once again, from skepticism to respect. But beyond the noise, something even more important was happening within them. That public confession had burned away the last remnants of pretense between them. They no longer existed as businessman and baker, savior and survivor. They were equals now. Two people who had faced the full weight of the world's judgment and had come out standing, not because they were flawless, but because they refused to be defined by fear. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Lena worked harder than ever. Together they launched a new foundation, the Heart Project, aimed at supporting small entrepreneurs who had been crushed by corporate systems just as Lena once had been. It wasn't charity, it was empowerment. Ethan poured his resources into it, but it was Lena's vision that guided it. She insisted on transparency, community involvement, and hands-on mentorship. "If people can learn to stand," she said during one of their early meetings, "they won't need to be rescued." Watching her lead, Ethan realized that strength didn't always come from dominance. Sometimes it came from grace under pressure, from the ability to keep showing up even when the world tried to erase you. One afternoon, while reviewing proposals, Ethan found an old photograph tucked between Lena's folders. A picture of her mother standing in front of the original cafe, holding a tray of pastries, smiling as if the entire world existed in that single golden moment. On the back of the photo in faded ink were the words, "Build something that feeds souls, not egos." Ethan stared at it for a long time, then set it on his desk, a silent reminder of everything they had fought for. Later that evening, he found Lena watching the sunset from the balcony, her hair caught in the breeze, her face illuminated by the last light of day. He joined her, the photo still in his hand. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. Lena turned toward him, her eyes glistening. She always believed life was about what you leave behind when you're gone, she said. Not money, not fame. Just how many hearts you made lighter. He nodded slowly. Then she's right. You've made mine lighter. There was no grand confession, no cinematic declaration. Just truth, pure, simple, and enough. The storm that once threatened to destroy them had instead burned away everything false, leaving behind something unshakable. Their bond was no longer defined by a contract or circumstance, but by a shared understanding that pain, when faced together, becomes power. The city that once doubted them now looked to them as proof that redemption was possible. That even in a world obsessed with image, sincerity could still win. As the night settled, Ethan looked out at the glittering skyline and said softly, almost to himself, "All my life I thought success meant building towers. But now I see the tallest structures aren't made of steel. They're made of faith, kindness, and the courage to start again." Lena smiled, her hand brushing his lightly. "And sometimes," she said, "the smallest hands can hold the biggest dreams." And so, they stood there, not as savior and saved, not as myth or headline, but as two people who had walked through fire and found peace on the other side. The world would keep talking, as it always does, but they had learned the most important lesson of all, that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It simply needs to endure. Time, when it finally slowed for them, felt less like the turning of a clock and more like the deep exhale that comes after surviving a storm you never thought would end. Months passed, then a year, and the world that once watched their every move seemed to grow tired of chasing stories that no longer burned with scandal. Cole Enterprises stabilized into a company guided by purpose rather than ambition alone, its name now synonymous with integrity. The Heart Project blossomed across the city and beyond, helping hundreds of small creators find the courage and resources to stand on their own feet. Lena became its living heartbeat, appearing at workshops, mentoring young dreamers, telling them that greatness was not measured by the size of their audience, but by the depth of their persistence. Her words carried the weight of lived truth. When she spoke about failure, it wasn't theory, but memory. She had once stood at the edge of losing everything, her cafe, her hope, her faith in goodness. And now she stood as proof that a heart unbroken by bitterness can rebuild worlds. Ethan often watched her from the background during these events, proud in a way that words could not capture. He had been a man forged by control, and yet through her, he had learned the art of surrender, not to weakness, but to authenticity. Their days together became a rhythm of simple things that once would have seemed trivial to a man of his stature. He would wake before dawn and make coffee while she arranged flowers on the kitchen counter. They talked not about stock prices or contracts, but about dreams. Hers of expanding the foundation to rural towns. His of transforming corporate culture into something that valued people as much as profit. At night they would sit on the balcony where city lights painted the air in gold, sometimes speaking, sometimes letting silence say everything. The contract that had once bound them by necessity had long expired, yet neither mentioned its end. It was as if the paper had dissolved into something far greater, a shared promise written not in ink but in understanding. The world still labeled them in headlines, the power pair, the tycoon and the dreamer, but within the glass walls of their home they were simply Ethan and Lena, two souls who had discovered that success without peace is poverty in disguise. But life, as always, tests what it builds. It happened quietly on an ordinary afternoon, when Lena received a letter bearing an unfamiliar seal. Inside was an offer from a global foundation in Europe inviting her to lead an international initiative for small business development, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that would take her away for at least 2 years. She read it twice, her heart swelling with pride and hesitation. That evening she told Ethan while they walked through the rooftop garden. For a moment neither spoke. The city below murmured like an ocean of choices. Finally Ethan said softly, "So the world has found you." She looked up, half smiling. "It's not about fame, Ethan, it's about reach. Imagine how many lives we could touch." He nodded slowly, hiding the ache that rose in his chest. "You should go," he said. "You were never meant to stay caged by my walls." "They're not cages anymore," she whispered. "They're memories." The following weeks were filled with quiet preparation, farewells, meetings, endless logistics. The media speculated endlessly, painting her departure as the end of their story, but for Ethan and Lena, it felt more like a new beginning. On her last night before the flight, they stood once again by the same window where everything had begun. The city stretched beneath them, vast and glowing, the same skyline that had once felt like a battlefield now appearing almost tender. "Do you remember the first time you brought me here?" she asked. "I thought this place was too big for me. I felt like a guest in a museum." Ethan smiled faintly. "And now?" She turned toward him, eyes luminous. "Now I know I was never too small. I was just standing too close to the wrong kind of light." For a long moment they said nothing. Then Ethan reached into his pocket and handed her a small worn envelope. Inside was the deed to the Whispering Bean, her cafe now debt-free and registered fully in her name. "It was yours from the start," he said quietly, "but I wanted you to hold it when you truly believed it." When morning came, the airport was quiet, the sky washed in pale amber. Lena turned at the gate, her suitcase beside her, and met Ethan's gaze one last time. There were no promises, no confessions, just mutual certainty that distance could not undo what had been built through truth. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" he asked. "For seeing the strength I couldn't." He gave a faint nod. "For reminding me what it meant to feel." The boarding call echoed through the terminal, and with a last small wave she disappeared into the crowd. Ethan stood there until the plane was a silver streak fading into the horizon, the weight in his chest not sorrow but an unfamiliar, peaceful fullness. He realized that love, in whatever form it existed between them, was never about possession. It was about freedom. In the months that followed, letters and calls bridged the miles. Lena sent updates from small villages where her programs rebuilt livelihoods, where women opened bakeries and men repaired tools with pride instead of shame. Ethan, meanwhile, transformed his empire further, turning his corporate headquarters into an innovation hub for ethical business, where employees were treated not as resources, but as partners. When asked by journalists about his sudden philanthropic focus, he would smile slightly and say, "Because someone once told me small things matter most." 2 years later, Lena returned. The foundation work had grown beyond expectations, but her heart longed for the scent of roasted beans and rain-damp streets of Arlington. When she walked into Whispering Bean again, the bell chimed just as it had that first morning years ago. The cafe was still warm, familiar, alive with laughter. Behind the counter stood a new manager, one of the many young women Lena had mentored. As she looked around, her gaze fell on a framed photograph near the window. It showed her and Ethan standing beside the opening sign of the Heart Project, smiling not for the cameras but for themselves. Beneath it was a small plaque that read, "Built on Truth. Sustained by kindness." That evening she found Ethan waiting outside, leaning against a lamppost as if no time had passed. He looked older, softer around the edges, but his eyes carried the same steady fire. "Welcome home," he said. She smiled, feeling the words settle into her like warmth after winter. They walked together through the quiet streets, not as lovers or partners defined by contracts, but as two travelers who had reached the same destination by different roads. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if you hadn't walked into my cafe that morning?" He chuckled. "Then the universe would have found another way. Some things are too necessary to be accidents." As they reached the corner where the city met the river, the sun dipped below the skyline, bathing everything in molten gold. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from distant streets, the world moving forward as it always does. Ethan turned to her, his voice low. "You once told me you were afraid of losing yourself in a world you didn't understand. Do you still feel that way?" She shook her head. "No, because now I understand that the world isn't something to fit into. It's something you shape, one act of courage at a time." He smiled, looking out over the water. "Then I suppose you finally made it fit." She laughed softly. "Maybe we both did." They stood there until night descended, the city lights flickering to life one by one like scattered constellations. Neither spoke again because there was nothing left to explain. Their story had begun as a transaction, evolved through trials, and ended in quiet triumph. A testament that the smallest beginnings can ignite the largest transformations, that compassion can survive even in corridors of power, and that sometimes the people who enter your life as storms leave behind the clearest skies. In the years that followed, legends would grow around their names. The billionaire who rebuilt the meaning of success, the woman who taught an empire how to feel. Yet those who knew them best would say their greatest achievement was not wealth or fame, but peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop fighting to prove your worth and start living it. And somewhere in that peaceful corner cafe, where the scent of cinnamon still danced through morning air, a small brass plaque glimmered beneath the sunlight. The world said she was too small. She proved that small things build forever.